Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to Sporty's webinar presentation, Tips and Tricks to Passing Your Check Ride with Designated Pilot Examiner Jason Blair. So happy everyone could join us tonight. My name's Eric Radke from Sporty's. I'll be your facilitator for this evening. And first and foremost, a big thank you to our event sponsor tonight, Sporty's Pilot Shop, for hosting our webinar series where we talk everything from technology to technique. And of course, tonight, one of those unifying topics in aviation. It's hard if you have a collection of pilots. It's rare that pilots will agree on any one topic, but boy, when it comes to check rides and everyone kind of have that same feeling, a little bit of angst, a little bit of trepidation when it comes to check ride time, I think that's a point that all of us aviators can probably agree upon. Some of it healthy, it can certainly reach the unhealthy level, but we're in great hands tonight with Mr. Jason Blair to help us all navigate the ins and outs of check ride time and hopefully put us all to ease. I have a few housekeeping items before we bring on Jason for the core of the presentation. Do know that tonight's presentation is recorded in its entirety. So if you do miss a particular point or want to come back and view and review later or tell your friends about it, we will have the presentation posted on Sporty's YouTube channel as well as in our webinar archive at sportys.com/webinar. So you can come check that out at your leisure and view and review as often as you'd like. Also, throughout the presentation, we would invite you to submit your questions. I'm sure you have some very direct questions when it comes to check ride time, and you can do that via the GoToWebinar software, and we'll pull those together and aggregate, and then we'll have some time at the end to pose those to Mr. Jason Blair. So with that, I am delighted to introduce Mr. Jason Blair, a good friend of mine, aviator extraordinaire. When it comes to anything general aviation, quite likely Jason has done it at some point. Everything from thousands of hours of instruction giving to operating a flight school, operating an FBO, former executive director of the National Association of Flight Instructors. Most recently, Jason has a number of books that he has authored that are available through Aviation Supplies and Academics, ASA. I would invite you to check those out. Be sure to check out Jason's website, jasonblair.net, to learn a little more about him, all that great resource material you can access, and any of those great books. And Jason also writes for a number of aviation publications, kind of industry-wide with a lot of great content and insight. So be sure to look for Jason at your next opportunity. And of course, most recently, Jason, I would dare say, is one of the nation's most preeminent designated pilot examiners, has conferred thousands of certificates and ratings. So again, we are in great hands. And with that, Jason, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I don't even know how I'm going to live up to that that billing here now. That's pretty good. It makes me sound like I know what I'm doing. I'm pretty fortunate to have lived a good life with a lot of aviation, and I talk with a lot of people, and they say, "Man, do you like your job?" And I say, "It's not digging ditches. This really is kind of fun stuff." And I think that's one of the cool things that brings all of us together as aviators. There's very few of us that come to either the career or the passion of aviation because we hate it. It's really kind of cool. We all like being here, and my God, we get to defy gravity for a living if we do it for a job or at least for some fun. It's pretty darn special. So thanks for having me, and certainly a pleasure to be here and share everything I can. I appreciate that you are recording this and letting people, see this again. And one of the tips I always tell people, whether you're doing a check ride with me, especially if you're doing it with me or somebody else, use those resources. And this is going to be one of them that we hopefully have you find some things that are useful out of if you got a check ride coming up, or if you have friends who have check rides coming up, pass it along to them. It's many times I get students that, they come to a check ride and they say, "Hey, did you Google me ahead of time?" And they say, "No." And so, "Geez, man, why not?" And, "Well, I didn't know I could read the things you've written before your check ride." And my answer is, that's not cheating. That's just good homework. So, we don't really care why you learn the stuff as examiners. If you learn it ahead of time and it's something you can incorporate into your flying to be safer and more successful, great. So use these tools, and, Sporty's has certainly got a whole bunch of them. And hopefully you learn a little bit here tonight. And, check out those examiners ahead of time, and especially if you're going to come do a check ride with me, read some of the stuff that I've written about. It's pretty safe to say if I've written about it, there's a good chance someone's going to show up on a check ride, and that holds true through with a lot of the examiners around the country. So, there's one tip right off the bat. Check us out and see what you can learn ahead of time. So with that, I guess, Eric, it's a pleasure to be here, and certainly love supporting the work that Sporties does. And I guess it's probably time to dive right in here, isn't it?
Thank you, Jason. Absolutely.
Well, let's start with some tips and tricks for everybody, but I always kind of like to talk about, what are we going to talk about first here? And we're going to talk tips and tricks that's going to make the check ride go smoother. Make sure you don't miss things that are going to be tested. And the whole goal here is make it more likely you're going to pass on the first try. At this point, I've done a little bit under 2,000 check rides, we call them, the practical tests. So this is all data that I've gotten and things we've learned as we've gone through the check rides. That's what I'm going to leverage here for us to try and learn a little bit about it. I actually act out of the Grand Rapids, Michigan FSDO. Designees at this point are not necessarily limited to where we do check rides. We can kind of go around the country. However, obviously, most of us stay fairly close to home and when there's busy. I've been an examiner since 2007 and actually started flying in 1993 when I was 15. So I had the fortune of starting this early. As Eric mentioned, I still actively provide training for folks, do a lot of aviation writing, and have worked for some of the associations. So I think it's interesting for us to start out with, what is a DPE? We're a designee of the FAA. We're not FAA staff. Or people doing the work of the FAA, and in this case, certifying pilots. And this is, kind of jokingly how most of the CFIs see us, right? We're the old curmudgeon that shows up and does these check rides, and they feed us some coffee and as we go. And this is, probably a little bit jokingly how the FAA sees us. We're the guys that just hand out a whole bunch of certificates, right? If we think about how the applicants see us, it probably feels more like this, especially when we ask these really hard questions like, "Are you sure?" when you give us an answer. The reality is this is how we actually probably are, and I say this kind of jokingly to lighten the mood here. We really are pilots and instructors out there who are doing something to try and certify you, and we're looking forward to doing it too, and we want to see you pass, and we want to help you get through this too. So if we talk about the purpose of the practical test, this is kind of an important piece. Our job is to determine if the applicant has actually learned what they need for that particular rating or certificate, whether it's a private pilot or an instrument pilot or CFI or something advanced. We do that based on the airman certification standards, or in a couple of cases, practical test standards yet. We still have those for the flight instructor. And actually some of the things like recreational pilot and sport pilot have not been updated to the ACS yet. That is actually a minimum standard the FAA has set forth that we have to make sure that somebody meets when they come to it. So our job is to use these standards to evaluate knowledge and abilities, the actual physical abilities of flying throughout the test. So when you come to a check ride, if you've never seen the ACS standards or the PTS standards, that's absolutely something that's going to leave you at a detriment, because that is, in effect, our menu for the practical test, the check ride. We're authorized by the FAA to do that job and to make sure that the people are meeting these minimum standards. And that's what's going to happen on the practical test. We are going to not stray from that if we're doing our job properly as an examiner. So that is what we end up doing and making sure that those standards are met. When we do a practical test, it doesn't even start until we have qualified the applicant. And this can actually be something that's a little bit challenging sometimes. We need to make sure that the proper documentation, this is where the government bureaucracy of paperwork kicks in, to make sure that the individual who's there for a test has met all of the aeronautical experience, the ground training requirements, they have all the proper endorsements, things like that. So when we first get there, you shouldn't really expect the examiner just to dive right into questions with you. They're going to sit down with you. They're going to go through typically an IACRA form, which is the online application process, maybe a paper form in some cases, but it's typically a digital one. We're going to look at your endorsements, check out your logbook, and make sure you're actually qualified for that practical test, because if you're not, we are not supposed to be giving you the practical test. So it means the paperwork's really got to be in order when we get there. Once that's done, we're going to give you a briefing about the practical test. And this is basically telling you what's going to happen on it. We're going to brief you about the things that we're going to test, make sure you understand that it's going to be on the ACS standards, make sure we're there both for the same practical test, certainly we've got the right person, and tell you how the process is going to work. We're going to tell you about how long it's going to take, where we're going to do this, what the expectations are, and then there'll be an additional briefing actually before the flight portion also that's specific to that. Once all of that is done, and this is kind of the applicant's last chance to run, we'll say, do you still want to start? And if they're good with it, they understand the test, and everybody's ready, we're going to begin the actual check ride. There's two portions of it typically. One is the oral questioning, and then we have the flight demonstration. So we kind of have the ground and then the in-flight portion of it. For most practical tests, if we're thinking private, commercial, initial certifications like that, that ground's going to take an hour and a half to maybe even up to 2.5 hours and cover the areas in that Airman Certification Standards or the ACS or the BTS material there that's specifically going to be questioned on the ground. We're going to talk a little bit more about what some of the specific things are and some tips and tricks for it. But once we've successfully passed beyond that, we go to the flight demonstration, and that's typically an hour and a half to 2 hours of whatever the maneuvers are. Maybe it's an instrument ride. We're going to have 3 different approaches, and maybe a hold and some tracking and stuff like that. If it's a private ride, we've certainly got a bunch of maneuvers we do. Once we come back, we'll go ahead and debrief, tell you obviously whether you passed or didn't pass, and debrief you on some things that perhaps you can do better. So that's the general order of the practical test. We are not allowed as examiners to deviate from that order, which means if you look at the weather and say, hey, I see it's going to be thunderstorms here later today, can I start with the flight and do the ground later? That's not actually something we're allowed to do. So we have to stay with this order, and that's what you can expect. As we go through the check ride, some major expectations are that we're going to be taking your knowledge instead of just rote knowledge. If I say, hey, what's the stall speed of the Cessna 172, and you say it's 53 knots or whatever it happens to be, that's a kind of a rote knowledge. You can spit it back. What we're looking to do is get your knowledge to a little bit higher level, and this is where scenario-based questions come in. We're not going to ask you just that. We're going to ask you what happens if we proceed beyond this, or what if we change the configuration of the aircraft and add some flaps or detract some flaps, things like that. And what we're trying to do is understand whether your application and correlation-based knowledge level is there, whether you can apply the rote knowledge and that information that you've learned into real-world scenarios. And that's what we're looking for you to do, is tell us what you would do and how you would manage real-world scenarios that you're going to encounter that are related to that rating or certificate for which you've received the training. So that's really kind of an important piece of how you approach the check ride, is we're looking for you to be able to apply that knowledge that you've learned. When you went and did a knowledge test, it was a little bit more specific, a little more rote level, some understanding level things, but this is a practical test. We're looking for you to do things as you would do so in the practical flying world. So that's how we're going to ask the questions. We may give you some homework ahead and say, hey, we want to have you fly to an airport. Maybe it's going to be at night. And we're looking for you to get those scenarios into your mind and figure out how you would handle that in the real world. And then we're going to ask some questions about it. Some things you are going to absolutely need for a practical test, and this is where that pre-qualification comes in. We're going to need an application for that test. It's typically an 8710 application, although there's a couple deviations from that. If you're doing a sport pilot rating, maybe a slightly different form. And this is the application that the examiner will use to qualify and provide that documentation back to the FAA that they've conducted a practical test. It's also what generates your certificate later. Typically, it's done on iAccurate, it's the FAA's digital form of that site. We also need a copy of your knowledge tests if the knowledge test is required. So things like private instrument, they're going to be required. If you're doing an added rating, such as maybe a commercial multi-engine add-on rating, if you already have a commercial single engine, you may not need that knowledge test. So I put this up there for a lot of the tests. In a few cases, they won't be needed. We do need the original copy with the raised seal on it. We can't just accept iAccurate. There's some reasons for that the FAA requires examiners to do that. We're going to need a copy of your previous pilot certificate, whether that be a student pilot certificate, if you're getting an initial sport pilot, recreational, or private. And then if you are getting an advanced certificate, whether you're adding an instrument rating or something like that, we're going to need your previous pilot certificate. That is basically a legitimization that you have one of these, and we're going to match that up and make sure everything works closely together in the FAA system. We'll need some way of complying with the FAA medical requirements, whether that's either basic med or an actual medical. And in very few cases, you won't need something if it's for a sport pilot. But for the majority of these, we're going to need a medical of sorts. We need to have a photo ID that's government issued. There are many things that do count. There are a few things that don't. Typically most common are going to be a state issued driver's license or photo ID, a passport, or a military ID is also something that gets commonly used, and all those are accepted. accepted. We need to have the endorsements for that practical test. So, whatever the test is, your instructor has to have signed you off and make sure you are ready and eligible for that test. We're going to need to see the aircraft maintenance logs also. It's required for us as an examiner to make sure the airplane we're going to be getting into is legally operable and is maintained properly. So you're going to have those maintenance logs for the day of the practical test as well. This is kind of an interesting one. We need the log of flight and ground training. This is something that gets missed fairly regularly. It's a little less common that it gets missed in 141 based training because there's a syllabus that's being followed, but it does get missed quite a bit in Part 61 training, where if we have a logbook that has all of our aeronautical experience or flight training, but we have no log of ground training, we may not actually be able to give you a practical test. Now, there's not necessarily a minimum amount of it, but there are specific things that do need to be covered that are ground training. The FARs are very, very specific that we do need a log of ground training. So even just a notebook that includes, the date your instructor met with you, the subjects you covered, and a sign off, that's going to go ahead and meet that and give us something that gives us a ground training log. And then certainly our favorite part as the examiners is payment for us. The examiner should convey ahead of time how they would accept payment and what the price for that will be. So that's part of how we do our job. So all of those things are things you're going to really need to pull together before you actually start that practical test, and it's a good idea to have them with you. And even if you have questions ahead of time, reach out to the examiner and ask if you have any questions about what you're going to need or whether the endorsements you have are sufficient. It's certainly better to address that ahead of time than to have all of you get out to the practical test and find something missing. It does help if your instructor is available the day of the practical test. In the event that there are any hiccups in that process, it may be solvable. It's a lot harder when you find, and I'll reference a real world personal experience. It's a lot harder when you find the instructors in Paris in a simulator on a few time zones away, and you're trying to catch an endorsement for them. So that can leave you kind of stuck if any of these things are not ready. You may not actually be able to conduct the practical test that day because we're simply missing some of the paperwork that's necessary. Some of the things that are really common that do stop the check right before it is if we don't have maintenance logs, or if in some cases we don't have proper airworthiness directive tracking. A lot of times that's commonly missing. Certainly some airplanes have airworthiness directives that have shorter review periods, and one common one is the Cessna 172 in many of the models has a little seatbelt track that needs to be checked every 100 hours. And if we can't track when the last time that was conducted was, we may not actually be able to qualify the airplane. So making sure that AD tracking is there and we know the aircraft is certainly eligible to be flown is a good thing. Incorrect or missing endorsements is a very common one. If you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out to the examiner ahead of time and say, hey, here's what my instructor did for me. Is this sufficient? In modern times, this is really easy. I have in many cases taken a text from an applicant that was a picture. So here's the picture of the endorsements my examiner, my instructor gave me. Is this going to work for you as the examiner? And if I see something, I can say, hey, let's fix this or add that to it. That makes it a lot easier when we all get out to the check ride and we can give you the check ride. Missed training requirements is something that happens. I mentioned that logged ground training. Certainly required flight time is necessary. So do make sure you go through that logbook carefully, especially if you're cutting things like cross-country hours close in terms of your experience when you're going to do a rating or certificate. This happens fairly frequently in single-engine commercial initial certificates where we have some required flight time, and certainly for the instrument when we have a 50 hours of PIC cross-country time where we'll get out there and we'll find it's, they're at 50.2 hours, and I start kind of going through some of the cross countries, and we find one of them was a 36-mile airport to airport, and that doesn't meet the requirements, and we find ourselves short of time. So do go through those requirements carefully in your logbook and make sure they're there. But one that we've seen a few times is a missing flight review. Maybe you did your private pilot a couple of years ago, and you've been working on the instrument rating, and you just kind of forgot, maybe I need that flight review. So technically on the practical test, you have to be the PIC. So if you're missing a flight review, you want to check that out. not having an appropriate place to do the test is certainly something that we've run into as a stopping point. You know, if we're trying to do a check ride in the middle of the table with the donuts on Sunday morning while the local airport coffee clutch is sitting there having their morning chat, we're really not allowed to do that. The FAA basically tells us we have to have a place with 4 walls and a closable door that's not going to be interrupted while we're doing the practical test. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And then one of the other big ones is name mismatches in the paperwork. If we have your photo ID doesn't match your pilot certificate, doesn't match your knowledge test, you know, if we have a middle initial on one and a full middle name on another and a junior or senior on the third one, those name mismatches will cause paperwork hiccups later that will stop it from processing through. So the best thing to do is, if you're starting training, is to make sure that you pick something and you stick with it. And it's the most common is first name, middle name, last name fully spelled out. But if you do have a junior or senior or something like that, make sure it's on all your documents, including your knowledge tests and medicals and things like that. So those are some of the really common hiccups that'll stop a check ride before it even begins. And if you run into them, it's good to check for them ahead of time. I always kind of mention it's worth making sure you're really ready. You have all of the training requirements met. And I had this, can you consistently perform all of the maneuvers to and greater than the ACS or PTS standards? You know, a lot of times I have somebody call me and say, I had a good flight yesterday, and the first time I got those chandelles correct, or the first time I got those steep turns to hold good, I think I'm ready for the check ride. And, you know, what we're really trying to do is, can you do this consistently, not just once? You know, does your instructor really think you are ready? And if your instructor is saying they won't sign you off just yet, maybe it's a good time to think about whether you are consistently performing those maneuvers within standards. And one way to check that is also maybe have another instructor fly with you and serve kind of as a progress check to see if you're doing that. We're really looking for, you know, not necessarily the absolute minimum one-time lucky here. We're looking for you to be able to do this as a consistent performance within the standards. So, you know, make sure you're really ready for that practical test. I know we all want to get it done sooner, but sometimes a little pause, a little bit of delay can help you do a better job and pass it that first try. So let's talk about the ground portion here a little bit first, because that's the first part that most of us end up having on a practical test. So on the ground portion, the examiner is going to ask you questions, and I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier about how to apply knowledge that you have to specific scenarios. This is how we make sure that we are going to get you to, you know, have the knowledge that's necessary. It's important to know what's on the practical test, especially the ground portion. A lot of people get focused on the flying, and these ACS standards that we have, and some cases the PTS, they actually set forth what the examiner is going to test you on. It's amazing how many times I get to practical tests as an examiner. I say, so you've seen the ACS? And the answer I get is, well, my instructor told me a little bit about it. Do you have a copy? No, I've never actually read it. Well, this is our menu for the check ride. So I would absolutely encourage anybody who doesn't have these or hasn't looked through them to get a copy. You can certainly buy them from Sporty's. These are the ASA ones that are online. You can also get them for free. The FAA does offer downloads of them on the FAA testing site. Whichever version is going to be the easiest for you, best for you to work with, make sure you at least have a copy of that menu that we're going to be using for the test. It's really hard to pass a test if you don't know what's on it. So first thing is to know what's going to be on that ground portion, and that's how we're going to start it. It's absolutely worth bringing reference materials with you. There is nothing saying that we can't let you look some things up. This is a practical test. So references you would normally have available to you as a pilot are certainly going to be available if you bring them with on the practical test. And here we are, a picture with the 2013 FAR AIM. Boy, I might not be the best one to bring on here, and I kind of put that on there for purposeful reminder to tell people, make sure bring current ones. In the last few years, we have had some changes in some of the regulations. One of the most notable ones is we changed the requirement for a complex aircraft to be having experience on a commercial pilot certificate. We added this thing called TAA aircraft. It's technically advanced aircraft, and there's definitions about that. The 2019 FAR AIMs have that definition there. The 2018 FAR AIMs did not. It wasn't terribly long ago that I had a CFI applicant show up to a check ride with the 2017 FAR AIM, and knowing that those things have changed, I started asking some questions about how you would qualify an applicant, whether they could take a commercial practical test without experience in a complex aircraft. certainly having 2-year-old reference materials didn't help them on those answers. So make sure your reference materials are current, up to date, and are going to give you the best answers if you are going to bring reference materials with you. Know the aircraft details. These are kind of important things to do. I had somebody not terribly long ago who had downloaded a POH for an aircraft. It was not the same model. It was the same. I shouldn't say that. It wasn't the same year. It was the same model of aircraft, but there were some changes to it, and it actually led them a little bit astray. If we think about the aircraft details, imagine we're doing a multi-engine check ride. The Twin Comanche, a fairly common airplane, requires engine shutdowns to be done at greater than 5,000 feet AGL. The ACS only requires it at 3,000 AGL. So as an examiner, we have to hold you to the manufacturer's restrictions if they are more constrictive than the ACS or the airplane flying handbook would be. In that case, so if somebody does an engine shutdown at 3,000 or 4,000 feet AGL, we would actually generate a disapproval for that applicant because they're not doing their maneuvers in accordance with the airplane's operating handbook, the airplane procedures. So going through that POH for the aircraft is kind of an important thing to make sure if there are any standards in there that you need to adhere to, you're going to be doing so correctly. So, have a copy of that POH, even if it's a matter of grabbing the one out of the airplane, shooting a bunch of pictures, or grabbing the photocopier and making some copies of pages. Make sure you're familiar with the limitations of that aircraft and the details that you're going to be using for the test. Coming back to a little bit before that, 4 walls and a closable door, make sure you have a good place to do the check ride. The middle of the FBO is not a good place to do this. We want to have it so you're undisturbed. We want to have you in a place where you can actually spread out, do some work. A computer is not a bad thing to have. A lot of people do like having a whiteboard or chalkboard so they can draw on. If we ask you about systems, or if you want to make a list of things to help jog your memory, maybe we ask you something like, what are the required inspections an aircraft has to have to be eligible for flight. You can make some lists. So having a good place that's undisturbed, large workspace, if you want to bring charts or spread some stuff out, computer's a good thing. And even a whiteboard or chalkboard is a good thing to do. Set that room up, make sure you've got enough space, make sure you got a whiteboard you can draw on, make sure that computer works. It's a good idea to have your electronic flight bag, whether it's an iPad or Google tablet, something, whatever you're going to be using, make sure you have that stuff with you. Now, that's a good way to set the room up to do it like a pro here. If I walk in as an examiner, everything's laid out, everything's set up, and pardon me, but it looks like a study of OCD. It leads me to believe you're a fastidious pilot, you're getting your stuff together. It also helps organize you, so show up a little bit early, get stuff set there, and be ready, and have all that stuff set out. It's not a race either. So this is something that's going to take some time. We mentioned earlier, 2.5 hours on the ground, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours on the flight portion. This is going to take some time. When the examiner asks you a question, it also means you don't have to rush to that answer. Take your time, reference it if you need to, and think about it before you speak. It's always better to take some time, collect your thoughts, and make sure the answer you're giving is what you actually want to give instead of just guessing your way through it. I do always kind of tell people on check rides, it's always a good advice not to guess. While it's entertaining for me when people start to make up new stuff, it's certainly not helpful. So, if there's something you don't know, you're better off to tell the examiner, hey, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm pretty certain I know where to find it and how I could reference it. We're going to probably take a moment and let you look it up. If it's something a little bit longer, maybe you're working on a little bit of a performance program, we may even go catch a cup of coffee, use the restroom, let you do that, and come back and let you explain it to us. We certainly can't let you look everything up. We do need to see some knowledge, but a couple things here and there is by no means going to generate a disapproval from us. And this is just kind of a general piece of advice. If you treat it like a conversation, it does seem to be a little bit more comfortable. I know you're going to be nervous. Everybody's nervous when we do a practical test. I still get nervous when I do practical tests that are, things that I'm being tested on. But if you imagine it, I try to tell people, imagine I'm a really annoying passenger who knows nothing about this and just asks a lot of questions. That's really kind of what it is. This is not a grilling session. This is really a long conversation about flying, and we're looking to have you explain some stuff to us. We're not trying to trick you. We're not trying to trap you. We're just trying to get to whether or not you have the knowledge that tells us you're safe to go out and do what we're testing you for, whether it's a private pilot so you can go out and take some family and friends flying and not get anybody hurt or in trouble, or if it's an instrument rating that you're going to go out and fly safely in the National Airspace System with some reduced visibility, obviously. If you imagine that this is somebody who just doesn't know much about it and we're just a really annoying passenger, sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to think about it as a conversation. I want to give you an example question, and this is something that kind of talks about how we'll take it to a scenario level. If we grab this airport here, we have Taylorville. It's actually an airport, I think, out in Wisconsin that I looked at. We might ask you a question, something like, if you're approaching the airport from the northeast, how would you determine what runway would be best to land on, and how would you enter the traffic pattern? So we're really asking 4 or 5 questions here with this. So how do we determine what runway we're going to be on? I might say, well, you have the AWAS here that tells me we're going to get some information off the chart, right? So I can read my chart, Taylorville Airport, AWAS 3, 123.87. So I could go to the AWAS and figure out what the winds are doing. With that information, I might look further in that data block and say it's 622 feet. We got a star L, which means maybe there's some pilot controlled lighting. Longest runway is 4,000 feet, and we talk on 122.8, but it says RP 9 right and 27 right. Well, that might be something that you haven't seen a whole lot of. It means right pattern for runway 9 right and 27 right. So we're trying to get your chart knowledge out of this. If I look at the little block there with the airport, it looks like I've got 2 runways, one kind of north-south, one, that looks like it's a east-west. I'm betting those are our 9s and 27s, but that 9 right, 27 right should be a cue for me that if there's a 9 right and 27 right, there might be a 9 left and 27 left as well. So if I grab an airport diagram and dig a little bit deeper, if we grab that AWAS, was 260 at 11, so I kind of know I want to land on a 27. We say what runway? Well, I'd kind of like to land on a paved runway. So 9 right and 27 tells us that we have 27 left. Well, if I want to land on 27 left, I remember there was something about that right pattern, right? So if I go back one more, I see it's 27 right that has a right pattern. So we're going to go back forward. 27 right is actually the grass runway. So do I fly a right pattern for 27 left? Well, if I really dig into this and apply that knowledge, we're going to find that that wouldn't be the case. If I was approaching from that northeast, I'd probably come over, enter standard traffic pattern, and fly a left-hand traffic pattern. But you can see how if we weren't paying attention here and we weren't digging in, it'd be pretty easy to say, well, I'd fly a right pattern for runway 27. And miss the fact that that was for 27 right, the grass runway. So this is where we get to build a scenario, and we can ask you multiple questions with this that gets you to dig a little bit deeper into that knowledge base. And what we're looking for you is take the time to figure out how you would do this if you were really in the air. And this is a real world scenario. If you're approaching an airport, we wanted to figure out how to enter the traffic pattern, we'd be looking for you to apply that knowledge on a practical test. So once we get down to the ground portion, if all goes well, we're going to tell you, hey, the ground portion is considered passed at this point, and we're going to proceed into the flight portion of the check ride. We will give you another brief for that portion and kind of set the expectations for what's going to happen on that, whether we're going to serve as a safety pilot on an instrument check ride, whether we're going to pretend we're a student if you're doing a CFI check ride for you, and then whether we're just going to be a good passenger in the right seat if it's private or commercial. Once we get into the flight portion again, I'm going to ask you some questions that are under scenarios. We might even have you start off as if you were flying across country. We might have you, deviate from that, but everything is still going to be in accordance with those ACS and PTS. So again, this is the standards that are set forth for it. So dig into those and make sure you know what they're going to be. As the examiner, it's important to know that we are not there to fly the airplane for you. We also aren't there to be an instructor. And this is a little bit different dynamic than a lot of people are used to having in the aircraft. It's also kind of hard to transition sometimes when you jump in the plane and you're looking for feedback from that senior person in the right seat. When I'm an instructor, I'm going to be giving you feedback. When I'm an examiner, I really am just riding along. And if I say, hey, let's do steep turns, you do the steep turns, and I say, all right, well, let's move on to turns around a point. You might be thinking, well, how'd I do in the steep turns? Generally, if we are going to have to issue a notice of disapproval, a failure for the check ride, we're going to tell you at that point. So if I haven't said, hey, your steep turns were a problem, you assume you're passing. So you are the PIC. If things are going good, we're really there just as an evaluator. We can certainly be a knowledgeable passenger for you. If you want us to hold a chart, we can do that. We'll generally help you look for some traffic. Certainly, if it's something that you can't see, we'll bring it to your attention. But generally, it's your job to demonstrate that you can be the PSE as if you didn't have an instructor, or in this case, examiner, there to help you. That's really what we're watching for. We might hold our window open if it's in the summer, especially this time of the year. You could do something a passenger would reasonably be expected to do, But the flying stuff's really up to you on your practical test. On the flight portion, it's always good to conduct a good, thorough pre-flight. Make sure that aircraft is good and airworthy. Hopefully we don't have any landing lights that are duct taped in. We've removed the chocks and we're not going to hop over them. We don't have any chunks hanging off. Is the oil cap back on? Have we done all these little things? One of the best things you can do is just before you're ready to go, step back 10 or 15 feet. Just give the airplane a good look over. Take a breath and see, are there any things that you're missing? These are all things that have happened on practical tests, and sometimes it's a matter of how you handle it. It's embarrassing when we hop in the airplane and forget the chocks, and many of us have done it, and I will admit I have certainly done it. What you do after that is when things can go good or bad. If you forget the chocks and you go to start up and you go, oh man, I forgot those chocks, and you look at the examiner and they're looking at you knowingly thinking, yeah, I was kind of curious to see if you were going to catch that. If you say, hey, I'm going to shut the airplane down, get out and do it, take a breath and remove those chocks and then come back, that's the right answer. If you're doing things safely and solving them properly, even a little hiccup's going to go ahead and be something that isn't going to generate a failure if you handle it properly. So, make sure that aircraft is fully ready. It's important to know the airplane. Study those aircraft systems. We have to ask about some of them, but know how the stuff in the airplane is going to work. Know the instrument panel, know how the avionics works. Sounds silly, but a lot of times we get into an airplane and the avionics have always been turned on. Maybe all the radios have always been on, or the intercom is on. Invariably, the day of that check ride might be the one day that the last person who rented that airplane from you shut the intercom off. And if you have never turned it on, it can be a really tough moment to try and figure out, is it broken or did I just not know how to use it? So make sure you know how the things in that airplane work. It's always a general, seemingly logical thing, but I have people do it fairly regularly, where they'll jump into an airplane to do a practical test in an airplane they're not familiar with the avionics. I even had somebody not terribly long ago fly up to Michigan to do a practical test in a 172. It was an instrument ride, actually, and they did a 1 hour checkout in the airplane and had never flown that particular avionics package or the GPS system before. It certainly didn't go well. They weren't familiar with how to set up approaches. If you're gonna try and do a check ride, make sure you're familiar with the airplane you're going to be using. It seems logical, but we get kind of down this rabbit hole sometimes of, well, one of the airplanes I was gonna use went down for maintenance, the other airplane has different systems, but my check ride's scheduled and the weather's nice. It can be hard to step back and say, look, I'm just not going to do it that day. Take the time, make sure you're familiar with it, and don't set yourself up for failure simply because something in the airplane is different than you're used to. As the examiner, I mentioned you're the PIC. We can't be the one that helps you work through that stuff. We can't program the approaches for you. We can't program the radios for you. If we have to, it's usually not a good spot on the check ride. General answer, you shouldn't have to ask the examiner how something works in the airplane because that doesn't demonstrate that you can do that as the PIC. Don't experiment on the check ride either. If there's a maneuver that you have never done before, maybe you weren't super familiar with that ACS, and the examiner said, hey, let's do that steep spiraling descent, and your answer is, man, I've never done that. My instructor missed that. Trying to do it on the day of the check ride and just work your way through it's probably not the best day to do it. Experimenting on the check ride's not typically the best thing to do. That's a good opportunity to say, look, I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm not going to lie to you, and let's move on. Every once in a while that does happen, especially if you're transitioning instructors. If we have an instructor that starts our training and doesn't stick around, moves on to the airline, and we transition into a new one, we do sometimes miss things. So, don't experiment on that check ride. Kind of similar to on the ground portion, relax, take your time, don't rush it. Where we see this most commonly being a problem is when we rush maneuvers. Make sure you do a full setup of the maneuver, do the clearing turns, and fully finish the maneuver. One common one that I run into is people forgetting to put the gear back up after a maneuver, or when we do engine shutdowns on multi-engine aircraft, they don't get all the way through the restart and securing checklist, and they forget to turn maybe the alternator number 2 back on, so we fly the rest of the flight minus one of the alternators, and sometimes that will generate future simulated failures that the examiner will take advantage of. So make sure you go through your checklist, do your setups on those maneuvers, and really fully finish them. It means take your time. There's nothing wrong with telling the examiner, hey, I'm going to take a moment to let's set up this this set of slow flight, and we'll get ourselves set up, clear our area, get everything ready, and do it like you've been trained. You are going to make mistakes on check rides, and that's fine. We don't expect you to be a perfect pilot either. We're looking for generally good, solid, safe performance. And sometimes if you make a mistake and you're fixing it, it shows the examiner you're good control of that airplane, you know what's going to happen and how to fix it. None of us are perfect pilots either, and fixing errors is an important part of being a good pilot. When we get more worried is when somebody is consistently outside of the standards, or if they have made mistakes and they don't seem to be aware of it, especially, or aren't making positive corrections for any deviations from what they're really trying to do. Kind of a joking humorous thing that we see sometimes is when somebody says oops, oh darn, things like that. I'll be honest, as examiners, if things are riding along and we don't notice something, you saying oops really kind of cues us back in. So if you're 20 feet off on that steep turn and you start making an oops out of it, we may have thought things are going perfectly. Don't necessarily draw attention to things that are a little bit out. We're going to do our best job to watch what you're doing, but you don't have to make a big deal of really small mistakes either. And it seems logical, but don't scare the examiner. We try to have a good, safe flight that's out there, and doing things that really scare us does generally not make us want to pass you. So communicate with us what you're doing. Tell us what's happening and talk through the check ride as much as you're comfortable or able to do. I want to talk a little bit about a maneuvers demonstration. This is kind of an example of what happens during the flight portion. If we imagine we have an emergency descent as one of our maneuvers. It's a private pilot maneuver. It also happens to be in the commercial. We do this in a scenario that's established by the evaluator, which is the examiner in this case. It does say we reference the airplane flying handbook, and this is where it's important to understand how these maneuvers things work. So we're looking, according to this, we have some skills. We're going to have to clear the area. That's where our clearing turns come in. We're going to use a scenario. The examiner might say, hey, we're going to simulate that we're flying an airplane and we have a need to descend quickly with our emergency descent. Maybe it's a loss of pressurization or something like that. I know it's not that relevant necessarily if you're flying a 172 or a Piper Warrior that we're going to lose pressurization, but we're developing a skill here. So we're kind of simulating a scenario. We're looking to go bank angle 30 to 45 degrees. We want to have airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, level off at a specified altitude. So maybe we start this at 6,000 feet. The examiner says, hey, we'll give you the scenario. I'd like you to level off at 3,000. Then we complete our checklist. So we have our basic description of what the maneuver is going to be here. But it leaves some things out in the questions. So one of the questions we run into is, well, should I do this with flaps or not? Or what if I'm flying an airplane that has a retractable gear? Should I put that gear down? Well, then we go back to that reference the FAA gave us. They said emergency descent. Some airplanes have specific procedures for rapidly losing altitude. The POH, Airplane Flying Manual, specifies the procedure. In general, emergency descent procedures are high drag, high airspeed procedures requiring specific airplane configurations such as power idle, propellers forward, landing gear extended, flaps retracted. In specific emergency descent airspeed may often include turns, right? So this is a little bit vague and actually leaves you some leeway with how it could be done. Some aircraft will actually describe how to do it. So if we look at a POH from an SR-22, they'll give you a description of how this maneuver should be done. Says power level idle, mixture as required, which is generally going to be forward. As long as we're not in heavy turbulence, we're going to 201 knots. So is that flaps up or flaps down? Well, that's a good question, but I know if I look at the Cirrus airspeed indicator, I certainly can't operate my flaps up to 201 knots or 178 knots. So that to me means we're going to be doing this maneuver with the flaps in the up position. If you're flying an aircraft that doesn't designate one or the other way to do it, you might be able to do it either way, flaps up or flaps down, gear up or gear down, but we're going to have to make sure we maintain operation within the limits of the aircraft if we do that. So if I were in a Cirrus to do this with the flaps in the down position, I certainly couldn't maintain my flap speed at 178 knots, and I would actually be operating in contradiction to what the POH says for a specific maneuvers demonstration. So while it might meet the airplane flying handbook, it does not meet the more specific description that the aircraft manufacturer has put on that aircraft. So it's important to kind of look through that POH again to make sure if there are specific maneuvers and how they would like them done, that you do it in accordance with those as well. So let's talk some general trips here. This is things that are going to be applicable for pretty much every check ride. Um, just because we've got it scheduled doesn't mean we have to do the test that day. Weather is certainly one of the biggest challenges that many of us have on the day of the practical test. Do we have good enough weather to do that? And it's actually something we're evaluating as an examiner. Are you able to make a good decision as to whether or not you should be doing that test? We do need to have adequate visibility and ceilings to do the entire practical test in accordance with the ACS or PTS, which means we can't be flying through a cloud without a clearance. Certainly, if we're on a private or a commercial check ride, we could do this on an instrument practical test under some limitations if we have a clearance and the examiner's willing to do that in actual IFR conditions, but we obviously shouldn't be doing it in a thunderstorm either. Make sure we have enough ground clearance to do those maneuvers and cloud and visibility. If it's in question, it means it's probably time to talk about rescheduling the practical test. So part of that test is to make sure you have good decision making, and that comes down to the weather. Certainly it's frustrating if you have to reschedule for it, and I think my record right now is 14 reschedules for somebody due to weather. Started to think the poor guy just had really, really bad weather luck, and it's frustrating, but at some point, that is good decision making. So consider the time as well. If you're not an early morning person, or if you work late at night, maybe doing it at 8 o'clock in the morning is not the best time. Do you have enough time to get to the airport ahead of time? Get the airplane ready, make sure you got everything set. What if you work all day and you want to try and do it at the end of the day? How tired are you going to be? Are you going to be performing at your best performance? So some of the things you might want to do is schedule it for a day when you can do it on a weekend, or maybe even take a day off to get that test completed. And it's certainly worth mentioning, when does it get dark? If we have a practical test that does require visual flying, which most of them do, if it's dark at 5 or 6 in the evening, especially in the winter, it may be tough to schedule that if we're trying to do it later in the day. I always mention it's really not a spectator sport. Having family and friends at the practical test, and to some degree even having them texting or phone calling you while you're trying to finish that test is a distraction. It does add some pressure. If you're coming to do your check ride, tell folks to leave you alone that day, maybe even shut that phone off, and just allow yourself to focus on what you're going to be doing that day. It's also really a tough moment if something does go bad on that practical test, to have 15, 20 people around there waiting for you just to say, hey, I'm going to have to finish this up another day. Focus on the test, leave family and friends at home, leave the phone off for that portion of it, and tell them you'll get a hold of them after, and let your focus be on the practical test for that day. I mentioned this earlier, you are going to make mistakes along the way, have good explanations, and if that's the way it's going, we're going to keep working with it as an examiner. Certainly strive for that best performance. The FAA puts the ACS and PTS out there. Those are minimums, but the honest answer is those are the equivalent of getting a D and calling it passing. Strive to be better, because, even a little bit extra pressure on the day of that practical test, if you normally keep those steep turns within 150 feet or within 50 feet, it might be a little closer with a little bit of nerve. So, maybe if you can hopefully keep them within 10 or 15 normally, you'll keep it within those PTS or ACS standards on the day. Try to actually exceed those standards of the PTS and ACS. Get the best you can. We don't want just barely good enough to be a pilot, do you? You want to be a really good pilot. So one way you can do that is certainly to be rested as well. I always kind of tell people a good piece of advice is don't stay up till 2 in the morning the night before that practical test and cram information in. If we're counting on that, it's probably not a day to take that practical test. You're probably not quite ready yet. Make sure you really get there, get some good rest. Make sure you, get that before you're actually going to perform a lot better. If you stop, get a good dinner that night, rest a little bit, get up and be ready for that oral portion of the test. I always like to hit some specific things. The private pilot test will start with some of the most commonly caused failures relate to short field landings. A lot of times this is just a positive aircraft control thing. We come in, the examiner says, what's going to be your touchdown point? You say, I'm going to land on the 500-foot painted markers, or the 1,000-foot markers, the touchdown zone markers, and we land short. So we're simulating that's the end of the runway. What the examiner is looking for you to do is not necessarily, just be perfect. But if you need to add a little bit of power, you can add a little bit of power. If you want to go around and come back and fix it, do that. We're looking for good decision making here, so you can do that. If something's not going to be right, we want you to fix it. Don't just commit to it and land 300-400 feet short of that point. In real life, if that's the scenario, just means we landed short of a runway and probably ran over some runway lights. So, be the pilot in command and don't let something happen that you don't want to have happen, including landing short. It's not uncommon that we get people to get lost on the check ride. If we simulate a loss of a GPS, or maybe an electronic flight bag that no longer is getting GPS signal, we're looking for you to do pilotage and dead reckoning to get out, look at a chart, identify some stuff on the ground, and actually navigate. Getting lost can certainly include busting airspace. We have somebody that gets 10 or 15 miles off, and if the examiner has to step in to have you stop from breaking airspace, whether that be altitude-based or laterally, that's usually the end of a practical test. So make sure you're familiar with where you are and staying in that spot when you're doing your maneuvers. If you're unsure, stop the maneuvers and go get yourself set back up. Setting up the maneuvers, are we doing slow flight properly? Do we have gear and flaps in the proper position? Are we doing it at the correct altitude? If we're trying to do ground reference maneuvers, we probably shouldn't be doing them 4,000 feet above the ground. The FAA says between 600 and 1,000. So make sure you're setting these maneuvers up correctly. And as a part of that is, be the PIC. Make sure you're actually in command of that aircraft. I use the bottom example here. It's not a super common one, but could you imagine flying an IFR to get to your practical test? People do really silly stuff sometimes. We had somebody that was their father was an active IFR pilot. They'd ridden with him they were committed to that check ride, and they actually flew their way to an airport for a private pilot practical test. And shot the ILS. So, make sure you're just not doing something completely silly. If we talk about the instrument ride, make sure you're proficient with how approaches work and how to read them. One of the things we've been able to incorporate as examiners with digital EFBs, things like our iPads, is asking about approaches around the country. When we certify you for an instrument rating, we're actually certifying you not necessarily just to fly at your local airports, but we're certifying you to fly anywhere in the country. And with the accessibility of more charts, many times we will ask about approaches in various places. We might pull up, if you're in Cincinnati, we might pull up an approach plate in Kansas City. It may not be one you've ever seen before, but if we're looking at an ILS in Kansas City and an ILS in Cincinnati, if you have the skill to interpret one, you should be able to interpret the other. So take your time and look through that stuff. So we will ask about approaches, not just specific ones. Another common one is not managing the ATC communications. Know who you're going to be talking with, know what approaches you're going to be doing, and we may change it up a little bit here as a part of the test for some deviations, but make sure you're communicating and working that with ATC. That's your job on an instrument ride to do it. Digital cockpit, and this is something I've actually written about a couple times. If we have a GPS system, a nice glass panel, and we've loaded up 3 or 4 approaches in it, we know what we're going to do, and then we have a change. Maybe ATC changes runways that you're using. We have to switch. Are you able to reprogram that and make sure you are ahead of that digital cockpit and making sure you're doing what you need to do? Busting clearances is fairly common, altitudes, and full-scale deflections on approaches. And this happens a lot of times when we start to lose that picture. We get a little bit bogged down. Maybe we're working on the management of the programming, and at the same time we lose that instrument scan and find ourselves a couple hundred feet off, or we've gone full-scale deflection on approach. One of the things you can certainly use as a tool on this is delay vectors. And we may actually even do this to you on purpose as an examiner, is give you a closely sequenced set of approaches. And one of the things we're looking for you to do is, can you manage either one, get them set up, or 2, have the savvy knowledge here to say, look, I'm going to ask ATC for a little delay vector, give myself some time, clear out my panel, and reset everything back up for when I'm really ready for the approach. I'll transition to the commercial ride here. Real common one is we're running into the lack of ability of commercial candidates to understand and apply what to happen with inoperative equipment. We're assuming here that you're a commercial pilot. Maybe you've been hired by someone to fly an airplane, and we find ourselves at an airport away from home, and maybe we break something. We come out, we find the landing lights burnt out, or maybe the flaps won't go back down, and the boss says, man, I just really want to get home, can we go? We're looking for you to apply required instruments knowledge, if there's an MEL or KOL or required instruments, and determine how you would handle that, and whether you as the pilot operator could fix something like that too. So it's a scenario where we can put you in and ask multiple questions related to it. It's still a very common thing, the inability to apply commercial pilot privileges and limitations, and really understand what you can do as a commercial pilot. Could you work for an airline? Could you get hired to fly somebody? Could you buy your own airplane and offer it up for charter, things like that? I'm not going to dig into all the answers here while we're doing it, but it's important for you to understand, if you are taking commercial check ride, what those specific limitations are and what you can do with it. And then additionally, assuming the maneuvers really are, at the private pilot level, we're looking for you to step that game up and be a commercial pilot. And some of those standards are tighter. Certainly short field landing must be to a tighter standard on a commercial check ride than it was on the private. So, you're looking to be a little bit better than that average private pilot here. We want you to be a commercial pilot when you take that check ride. We go to the CFI one. One of the biggest things I can tell people is it's a mindset thing to some degree. And if you think about this on a CFI check ride, you're not there to become a CFI. You're there to actually show that you are ready already, which means, being able to make sure if you're going to train people, the applicants you're going to train are going to have all of the requisite training. They're going to meet the requirements, and you're going to give them proper endorsements. You're going to make sure that you really know that your applicants are going to be ready and they've done everything. One of the kind of gut checks for me as an examiner is if I feel like you're going to be sending me applicants later, if we pass you, that will not be eligible or not have completed the proper training, you're probably not ready for me to pass you as a CFI yet. You're really there to teach that day. And I say this is, a little bit of a characterization that you kind of got to think about. You're not there just to be a right seat pilot explaining what you're doing. You're actually there to make sure the person in the left seat is able to learn from you how to do it themselves. And there's a big difference there. But if you apply that through the whole practical test, it's going to force you into a teaching mode where you're going to actually be a little bit better prepared for it. And use resources. This is fine. I've had people come in with literally thousands of slides and materials and things like that over the years. If I say, hey, I want to learn how to do a lazy 8, if you have, some books and some homework you're going to give me and maybe a slideshow, this is how we're going to teach. We think about how a good teacher teaches. This is what you got to do on a CFI check ride. So show up ready to actually teach, not just be a right seat pilot. On all the practical tests, certainly some common things are not having a place set up to do the test. It's pretty common that I show up to the check ride and the applicant says, well, where do you want to do this? I don't know. It's up to you. This is your home court. If I show up to your airport, go ahead and set that court up, be ready and have everything there. So let's get it set up. I should be the one saying, all right, where are we going for your practical test today? And you'll have a room set, off we go, and we'll be ready to do this. Very common in all levels of practical tests, especially for folks that don't own their own aircraft, is they have very rarely, if ever, seen the aircraft logbooks prior to the day of the test. So that makes it pretty hard to identify maintenance compliance and apply any inoperative equipment questions. So take the time ahead of your practical test, once, twice, 4 times, basically until you're bored with it and you really understand, to make sure you can qualify the aircraft as eligible for the practical test. In many of the tests, this is actually something we are going to test your skill on, not just validate the aircraft is legal for us to fly, but also make sure you have the skill to do it. So, do this ahead of time. Don't just do it the morning of the check ride. A lot of people think the examiner can kind of help. It's really up to you to coordinate the flying and the communication. Certainly with one kind of caveat on an instrument check ride while you're under the hood, and we're serving as a safety pilot as well as the examiner, we'll probably pick up radio calls for you that are visual traffic related, but really it's up to you to make sure that you can do all this stuff and coordinate it. And a simple one is, busting cloud clearances. I know we all want to get this done, but when we're skimming the bottom of the clouds or we're zigzagging between them, unless we have an IFR clearance and we're an instrument-rated pilot and can do this legally, that means we're breaking VFR cloud clearances, and that's an application thing that we need to see be able to do. And I've had multiple tests over the years where we have simply terminated, and it's generated a disapproval because we were breaking cloud clearances. So make sure you're kind of piecing these things together. With all that said, try not to be too scared. I know you're going to be nervous on practical tests. That's a natural thing. If you can, meet the examiner prior to the check ride. We are human, I swear it. We love flying. That's why we do it. We like seeing people pass. And even on your check ride, flying's fun. So, enjoy it a little bit. Don't be afraid to look outside the window a little bit. At this point, I know that was kind of quick through things. The good news is it's all recorded for you. So if you want to run back, you can check some of this. But I do want to open it up and offer some question time too here for you guys. And I will answer questions as long as Eric wants to feed them to us here.
Absolutely. Jason, let me take you back to the very beginning when you mentioned the idea of getting to learn about the examiner a little, and you kind of go in expecting that, people might Google you and read a little, read of your background and just get to know kind of what to expect. So let me ask you this. Should it be, or is it a little bit of a red flag on the part of the student if they're going up for a check ride and their instructor or the flight school doesn't know much or isn't able to offer much information? Do you put that onus on the instructor, or do you put more of that responsibility on the student?
That's an interesting question, and I will tell you that it's a changing dynamic on that. We're in a very active hiring environment for airlines, which is good for all of you guys doing check rides who want to do this for a career. It means your people are transitioning quickly to airline jobs or other professional flying. And to some degree, what that means is the instructors that are doing the training, they're the first pickings, right, that the airlines are going for. So in a lot of cases, they're not instructing as long as they used to. And what that means is they're not necessarily also getting familiar with the examiners over 3, 4, 5, 6 years like they used to. It might be, 8 months or a year that they're instructing. So they may have only sent in a student or 2 or 3 to a particular examiner and just may not have much information. Additionally on that, we've also had a fairly new group of examiners coming through the system over the last decade here. Like our pilot population, our examiner population is aging to some degree. I'm 42 years old. I'm one of the younger examiners around. And, as we find folks that have been doing check rides for 30, 40, 50 years, they do get to retire eventually, and that's okay. But it also means we have some newer examiners. So you combine those two things together, you may have new instructors and a relatively new examiner, and they just may not know much about each other. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad if you don't know much about that examiner at all.
This question can be applied to a lot of different scenarios, but I'll give you a specific example. Could you speak to how to best handle a conflict of opinion with an examiner? And here's the specific example. Examiner says climb to 4,000 feet to perform our stall series, and 4,000 feet does not quite meet your own personal minimums, and you prefer to have greater altitude clearance. How would you recommend addressing that with the examiner?
So I think it's a great question, especially if it increases safety. If you say, hey, I appreciate you said 4,000. I'd really prefer to climb to 5,000. My personal minimum's a little higher. Gives us a little bit more room for, looking outside. Obviously, hopefully it's not 5,000 climbing into a cloud. Maybe the examiner said 4,000 for a reason. Contextualize that a little bit. But if you tell the examiner I'd like a little bit better safety margin, boy, it's really kind of hard for us to argue with that as an examiner. To tell you, no, fly less safe. Boy, that's not the right thing, is it? So take your time. So, hey, I'm going to set my maneuver up. I'm going to go ahead and climb to 5,000 AGL or 5,000 MSL, whatever happens to be, just to put a little bit higher. But make sure you're not doing it in a way that's going to encumber other traffic. What if there's airspace above it? It might be worth thinking about. Is there a reason the examiner said 4,000 for that point?
Great point. A lot of questions related to the use of EFBs, digital charts, digital logbooks. Everything digital is becoming more and more prolific. But there's clearly, there's clearly some folks out there that are maybe a bit nervous that they're going to have a DPE that hasn't quite bought into the whole digital age. Is there anything advisory or regulatory that would preclude anyone from having their information digitally?
So here's the answer that we got about 2 years ago. It was actually not this year, it was 2 years before. As examiners, we get recurrent training as well. And one of the things that the FAA told us is, thou shalt allow electronic flight bags. You cannot tell the applicant they have to carry paper, okay? Now, that doesn't mean we can't ask questions like, what if your battery died? Or, things do happen. For example, if you're an applicant on an instrument check ride and you throw that lovely new iPad up on the dash on the 85-degree day in the sun, there's a pretty good chance it's going to overtemp. I've seen this on practical tests. I've seen it handled well when somebody's pulled out a backup device. Man, that thing overtemped. I'm going to throw it on the back seat, let it cool off. In the meantime, I have my iPhone or my second iPad, or I have some paper charts. So having a backup is going to work. When the applicant looks at me and says, I don't know what to do, here we are, IFR, simulated obviously, with a dead bricked iPad, and they have no answer. That usually doesn't go so well. So, it's about having resources and an understanding of the limitations of those. And this is actually something that's in the ACS. We talk about limitations of digital devices. So having a backup, it might even be, well, what if the battery died? Well, I've got a plug-in, or I've got an extra battery pack that I keep, and I can charge it, or I've got an extra iPad. Eric, I remember flying with you one time. Between you and I and Hal, I think we had 5 iPads on an aircraft. I think that would count for a backup. But, personally, I carry my iPhone. That's my backup. I actually have a battery pack on my iPhone as a case. I'm double backed up there. If my iPad dies and my phone dies, now I got a battery on that. So having a reasonable backup, I'm not saying you got to go crazy here, but having an option or two and understanding of those limitations. The same holds true of the logbooks. Certainly we have charting that works that way, but logbooks, nothing says that it has to be in a paper written, old school tabular form. Matter of fact, sometimes it's really nice to have things like a 4-flight logbook or a Log 10 Pro logbook, because as an examiner, if you log all of your time in there properly, you can print a report and hand it to me and show whether or not you meet the experience requirements. Having those logs is perfectly fine. It does mean you have to demonstrate to us that you can meet the requirements. And if you have somebody who's not super familiar with those particular tools, it means you should be proficient enough with them to show the examiner on the day of that you have the requisite time. And then if you have something that you're going to be using in the aircraft, what to do if you have a backup for it.
Thank you for that, Jason. A number of questions that are related to how written test performance and those written test results will influence or not influence the oral exam, whether that be knowledge codes or just score. In other words, does a 99% on a written exam indicate you're going to have an easier, quote unquote, or shorter oral, or does it have very little impact?
So this is, I think, a really kind of an interesting question. So we as examiners, when there is a knowledge test associated with the practical test, if you have to take a knowledge test prior to a private or an instrument or commercial, we are required to build a plan of action for that test. We have to look at those ACS or PTS and build a little setup that we're going to use for the day of, and that includes maybe things that we assign ahead of time for things that you're going to do. A scenario, it might be, a scenario of a cross-country flight to go pick a friend up and bring them back for the weekend or something like that, and we give you some weight and balance. One of the things that we are required to incorporate into that plan of action is the areas found deficient on the knowledge test. We actually have to incorporate those, which means we as examiners have to, prior to the test, go dig up what those knowledge test codes mean and make that a part of our testing for you, which means you obviously need to know what they are too, because they're going to be on the test. So we are going to go ahead and look those up, and we're going to incorporate them into that. And this is a great way of knowing that those are some of the things you're going to be asked about on your practical test. Now, the second part of the question, does the 99% mean you're going to have less questions on the practical or more, or do we ask more questions for getting that 72% and just barely squeaked by? To some degree, it means less questions, because if there are less codes that we need to incorporate, there's less things we're going to have to ask about that we know you got wrong. On the other side, I'm going to be honest. If you got a 99% on it, my gut tells me you did one of two things. Either you memorized it all, which is certainly still possible to some degree with some of the testing prep software, or you really studied great and did a good job. Which one is it? I don't know. It doesn't change what we do. Now, if I had access to the amount of time it took you to take the practical test, and I saw you got a 90%, or you told me it only took 9 minutes to get that 90%. Well, I'm going to tell you that's probably a rote memorization game if somebody tells me that, and we know that still happens sometimes. But it's getting harder and harder to do that as we change the knowledge test, and it is more application based. So the score has a little effect, but it's not really going to affect necessarily what's on the practical test in terms of the number of questions you're going to get, but it will drive what information we incorporate into our plan of action, because we do have to test those areas on a retest. And a practical test for the areas that you had on a knowledge test.
Sure. A little bit maybe on the negative side, but two different scenarios. Let's talk first about a potential discontinuance of a check ride.
Sure.
Kind of walk us through how that might play out and whose call might it be? Maybe specifically, can the applicant call for a discontinuance or pause the check ride for one reason or another?
And this is a really good thing to talk about. So once we start a practical test, and the examiner should brief you on this, you have three ways it can go. The first is the bad one. It's called a notice of disapproval. If something doesn't meet the ACS or PTS standards, we issue the disapproval. It just means we've got something that needs a little more study, a little more practice, things like that. The good one is a new temporary airman cert. The middle ground is kind of that one that, well, we just didn't finish. It's called a discontinuance. And actually the applicant can call for this hypothetically at any point during the check ride, with a caveat. We can't give you discontinuance to save you from a failure. So I can't be, doing my steep turns, I'm losing 300 feet of altitude and say, man, these aren't working, I'd like a discontinuance. Well, we've done a maneuver that's outside the standards, that's going to be a disapproval. However, I have flown on practical tests where the weather was changing. We get up, the applicant's doing some maneuvers, and we go to do something else, and the applicant says, hey, these ceilings are dropping, and I can't reach the requisite altitude anymore. We're going to have to stop. Well, if you're making the decision as the applicant to stop it based on good decision making, that's perfectly fine. We'll head back, we'll give you discontinuance, we'll finish it up another day. So I can't give you discontinuance to save you from a failure, but we can certainly discontinue if something is going to stop us from finishing the check ride. The most common reasons we get a discontinuance are for weather or aircraft maintenance, to be honest. If we come out, the airplane was being used before us, and maybe something happened on it. The flight before us had the flaps break, or the alternator number 2 stopped working, and they say, look, we can't take the airplane. We'll discontinue it. We'll finish it up another day. So, and that's perfectly fine if we need to have that happen. One thing I will add is we are, as examiners, not intentionally supposed to begin a practical test that we know isn't going to be finished within the same day. So, up here in Michigan, if I look out and say, boy, it's 2 miles viz, 300 overcast, and it's supposed to snow 14 inches today in February, I can't say, well, let's just do the ground anyway. We have to have a reasonable expectation that we're going to complete the practical test in the same day. That being said, we know the TAFs aren't always perfect, so we work with it the best we can. If weather conditions do change and we're not able to finish it, then we just finish it up another day.
Very good. Thanks for walking us through that. We'll let's end here on a positive note. And Jason, obviously, extensive amount of experience, thousands of check rides over a long period of time. Are there a few? We'll just focus very positive, get everyone thinking positive and focus positive. What are those few traits that you might zero in on when it comes to successful traits or qualities on that check ride app for that check ride applicant?
I'm going to give you a story on this one, and this is one that will always stick out in my brain. A young gal that we flew with, and every year at least once as an examiner, we have an FAA inspector ride with us too, and they watch what we do as an examiner. And we happen to have my POI, my principal operations inspector, my FAA, guy riding with me on the day, and this gal was in command of the ground portion. She was doing what we look for. She's the PIC. And we're looking for people to do this. She was working hard, going through college, paying for college, driving a garbage truck. A little kind of petite gal, 5'3", and you just have this image of this young gal working her way through college, driving a garbage truck. It's awesome. And we went and we did the flight portion, and my POI sitting in the back seat, and we're coming down final, and the tower called and said, "Hey, and we've got a Gulfstream catching you. Can you just go around for him?" And she was maybe 200 feet above touchdown and pretty committed to that short field landing we gave her. And she, without missing a beat, she said, "I'm committed to my landing. The safest thing for me to do right now is land, and I'll taxi off as quickly as I can. If the Gulfstream needs to go around, please let them know." And both my POI and I kind of looked at each other and like, wow, she's in command of this airplane. She is committed to that landing. She knows what the safest thing she needs to do is. And she got off the runway and taxied off, and she looked at us kind of a little bit sheepish. She said, "I'm really sorry if that wasn't the right thing to do." And my POI, before I could say anything, "Look, if he doesn't pass you, I'm failing him." And it was a demonstration you're in command of that aircraft. That's really the biggest thing we're looking for. Do you know what's happening, what you're doing, and if something's not quite right, how to fix it? We're there to determine, can you do that on your own without the help of an instructor, if you're alone or with family, friends, passengers, whatever it happens to be. So if you're coming in for that short field landing and it's not right, are you smart enough to go around, come back, and fix it? Are you in command of the aircraft so you're not going to bust minimums on an instrument approach? Do you know what your limitations and privileges are? We're looking to make sure we don't have to show up either one, to have an FAA inspector call you out and say, "Boy, you did something wrong here today." We don't want the tower to have to call and say you busted airspace. And most importantly, nobody wants to have to show up at that accident or incident where somebody's hurt, or worse. So, if you're in command of the aircraft, you know what's going on, and you're operating safely and conservatively, that's really going to give us a great demonstration you're on track for whatever that rating or certificate that you're looking for that day is. And those are the people we love to pass.
What a great story. Stay in command, stay in control, be in control of your own destiny. I absolutely love it. Jason, always a ton of fun. Had a great time tonight. Thank you so much for your time and all the insight as always. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Blair, jasonblair.net. Find him on your favorite social media channels, on Jason's website. And I know there's a lot of people out there saying, wow, this is the kind of examiner I'd really like to be working with. The bad news is Jason, like so many designated pilot examiners, is booked a long ways out. But you can get on his website and you can look for opportunities to book a check ride with Jason. We could have mentioned that at the very beginning too. With that, Jason, any closing thoughts or final words?
Thoroughly enjoy the work that you guys do at Sporty's, and if anybody isn't familiar with all of the products Sporty's is looking at, great stuff to prep you for that next check ride. Always love working with you, and anybody's got check rides coming up, certainly best of luck to you, and make sure you guys take your time and do well.
Appreciate that. You'll have a brief opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to complete a very brief survey as we close out tonight's presentation. We appreciate everyone joining. Do remember that we recorded tonight's presentation. We'll have that posted and available as early tomorrow. When you come back to sportys.com/webinar, be sure to take a look at our schedule for the remainder of the year, and hopefully you'll see a topic that piques your interest, and we'll see you back very soon. With that, for Jason Blair, I'm Eric Radke, Sporty's Pilot Shop. Thanks again, everyone, joining us. Have a great evening. Fly safe. Best of luck on that next check ride.